I'll be honest with you, I've never seen a ghost myself, but I've interviewed well over 750 people who have and have collected their stories. So that's what my book's about. That's what the tour's about. That's what our speaking engagement is about tonight, real ghosts. And I say that because people show up in the summertime on my tour sometimes with small kids expecting Casper or the Haunted Mansion at Disney. And I got to tell them wrong tour, because what I like talking about are real people from Charleston and the surrounding area who died in war, pistol duels, acts of God, and Mother Nature. Because I'll be blunt, there's only one ingredient necessary for a ghost story: death. Usually an unpleasant death. So it's not really pretty, but it is real. Now, one of the better strokes of luck I've had since I've been doing this many years ago, back in the 90s, a national news program went on my tour and filmed it. And it was good advertising. I got to put on my little business card at the time, seen on blankety blank. And that was the only good that came out of it. The bad stunk. For one, I was seen on worldwide TV wearing a colonial uniform, had on a puffy shirt, had on knickers, had a tiny lantern in my hand. I made a jackass of myself in front of the world. But the worst part was I spoke, and I said that Charleston, South Carolina was the most haunted place in North America. And I've got an abundance of flack from that naive statement. I've heard from Salem, Massachusetts, Savannah. One guy in Haiti actually wrote me a letter, and I never wrote him back and said, dude, leave me alone. Haiti's in North America. I accepted his criticism because he was correct. I don't have a little meter I can hold up that'll tell me the ghost population of this place. I think Gettysburg is probably the most haunted place in this continent. Think about it. 20,000 men died there in 3 days. That's what I call a supernatural supernova, a cataclysm of violence. What we have in the Low Country is spread out over 300 years. We got a story from the golden age of piracy. We've got stories that took place in the early 1960s and almost everything in between. Now, I think my favorite ghost story of all time, if I may start with one, is the Dock Street Theater. And to talk about the ghost, you got to actually know the history of the building. It was the site of the first theater in the country, 1736, a fairly ugly barn-looking structure. It burned, and then they put the Planters Hotel on that site in 1809, and the place was the epicenter of antebellum ribaldry. It was filled with drunken actors, ladies of the evening. It was high-end and debaucherous. But it fell into ruins after the Civil War. Nobody had the cash. Nobody had the spirit for that kind of frivolity after 1860. It became a flop house. It was covered with vines. It was filled with rats and roaches and pigeons. But Charleston got 300 grand from FDR during the New Deal. And with that WPA money, they put a theater in the shell of the old hotel where the first theater had once been. So it's had an amazingly funky metamorphosis. But since the 1930s, mid-1930s, well over 110 people have seen a female ghost walking down the second floor hallway of the Dock Street Theater. Beautiful young woman, early 20s, bright red hair. Her dress is lavender with what looks like yellow lace sleeves. But the thing people never forget about her, it looks like she's walking on her knees down that hallway. She isn't. She's walking on the 1830s floor from back when it used to be the Planters Hotel. In the 1930s, the first renovation they did was elevate the floors a couple of feet. So she's walking on her old turf, oblivious to what's been built up around her. Now, she's believed to be a woman who worked as a prostitute in the middle of the 19th century, who was killed in the building mid-1830s. But the people that live in that neighborhood, the French Quarter, have made up this crazy cockamamie story that she was actually an opera singer that dated John Wilkes Booth's father. I think what those people have done in that neighborhood is tag a famous name to the not-so-famous ghost. I like to call it the Chamber of Commerce syndrome. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Many years ago, I was walking down Queen Street on a very hot day. Carriage tour rolled by. And I always listen to those carriage drivers to make sure they're keeping it real. This particular guy was not. He told his group that Robert E. Lee haunted the Mills House Hotel on Lower Meeting Street. And I wanted to fling something at him because wherever you're from in this great world of ours, you should know that Lee could be a ghost. The guy died with a lot of guilt in his conscience. He died with a lot of sorrow in his soul, but wouldn't it be the battlefield in Virginia? Maybe Arlington, the mansion he never got to go home to? Perhaps Appomattox, where he signed away the Confederacy to that rummy U.S. grant. But wherever it is, it ain't a hotel in Charleston where he stayed for a couple of weeks at the beginning of the Civil War. My point, people love to put the famous name to the not so famous ghost. Be aware of it in your travels. It's kind of like reincarnation. I'd like to know how many Caesars and Pattons walk among us. I'd love to get them all together and go, no, you weren't. You were a scurvy-riddled ditch digger from medieval times. You weren't famous. But fame and notoriety, so books and tours and T-shirts, much more than a woman, a desperate woman who died in the middle of the 19th century working as a prostitute. Now, right around the corner in that same French Quarter neighborhood is a building I've often called the most haunted building in Charleston, Coogan's Porch. The restaurant's been there since the spring of 1976, but the little house it's in has been there considerably longer. Now, in the early 20th century, female teachers were not allowed to date nor get married in the state of South Carolina, because I think, as I've been explained, the good old boys who ran things thought a man would pull them away from the profession, and they needed all the teachers they could get. So the two sisters that lived in what is now Coogan's Porch, Zoe and Elizabeth St. Amand, were very lonely little old ladies. They had each other and a group of third graders as a social circle. One afternoon, early afternoon, 1945, Liz slipped and snapped her neck on the staircase in the house, and Zoe was alone for the last 9 years of her life. And I think she got sucked back into that house after she died in 1954, because she's been seen well over 500 times, usually in the ladies' room during brunch, which is awkward, as you might imagine. I got an email many years ago from a woman from Knoxville, Tennessee. She said she was having brunch at Coogan's Porch. Beautiful, gorgeous spring day back in the late 90s. Nature called. She had to go inside and use the bathroom. And as she was sitting there, she saw these 2 feet stick in underneath the stall door. Black patent leather shoes with buckles on the side. She said they looked like witches' shoes. And it frightened her, so she asked whomever or whatever was on the other side of that swinging door, "Can I help you?" Nothing. Feet didn't move. Twice more she asked, and when the feet didn't budge, she freaked and shoved open the stall door. In her email to me, she said she saw it slice through an old woman in a black dress, then slice back through her as it slammed shut. Well, needless to say, the Tennessean left the can quickly. You might say she left in flagrante delicto. Her husband was still stuffing an omelet into his face. Didn't see her run across the street to the Mills Hotel. She called him up. They went home early. Their vacation was literally cut short by a ghost sighting. But I'll never forget the email, because it began, "This was the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to me," meaning running out of a restaurant at high noon, half nude. But it ended, "This was the most fascinating thing that ever happened to me. Who did I see?" And I sent her a picture of what Zoe looked like in life, and I think it gave her some closure. But what I'd like it to give you listening is the idea that it doesn't have to be a dark and stormy night to see a ghost. It can be a beautiful 68 sunny degree day, and you can see an apparition. Now, by the way, the French Quarter and the College of Charleston, in my mind, are the 2 most haunted parts of Charleston. Although down on Legree Street, there's a whole covey of good stories. Over at the College of Charleston, though, one of the creepier stories, because it's an audible ghost story rather than a visual, is the old orphan asylum. It's currently the Joseph Berry dorm on the corner of Calhoun and St. Philip Street. Since, I don't tell this story very often, but it's interesting. The girls that used to live in that dorm back in the 90s and early 2000s, when it was an all-female dormitory, experienced 2 things. And both of them happened at the worst time for something creepy to occur, between midnight and 5 a.m. The first, very innocent, easily explainable, fire alarm pull-down pranks, until you realize they happen in that dorm twice a week on average. Christmas, summer, spring break, those alarms would go off between midnight and 5 a.m. It's a hassle, as is it is also dangerous. I mean, none of the kids evacuated the third time it happened. Two ladder trucks had to show up every time, so the school went out of their way to make it stop. They booted the freshman males in, I think, 93. Thought it was their drunken shenanigans behind these fire alarms. They actually covered the alarms with a spray, a substance called hydrastis, at some point in the early 2000s. The purpose being, if you pulled the alarm, it left a purple thing on your hand, a mark, and they had a black light that they would shine on everybody's hand as they re-entered to see who had the mark of sin. The building's been rewired numerous times, but they never caught anybody, not even a shadow near them when the alarms went off. Now, the other thing that happens in that dorm is much more interesting and far more frightening. Disembodied voices. Everybody's heard it now, going back to early 1991, so it sounds like little kids, little female kids playing Ring Around the Rosie somewhere off in the distance. It's vague, it's muffled, but it's obviously a large group of little girls playing. They come out of the air conditioner vents in the ceiling. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes they're punctuated by the sound of marbles being dumped on the floor. One girl I interviewed, who I'm certain will not win the Nobel Prize for wisdom, said that for 3 months she thought her neighbors were having a satanic ritual at 3 a.m. She could hear them chanting on the other side of the wall. But it took this girl 3 months to realize she didn't have any neighbors. She lived in a corner room on the top floor. Those sounds were coming straight out of sheetrock. Now, if you're cynical, you know very well that all that stuff could be the work of giant rats, humidity, or maybe a legacy of dedicated pranksters. But listen to this. Where that dormitory now sits was once the site of the Charleston City Orphan Asylum. It was the very first white orphanage in this country, 1790, and it was gargantuan. It was nearly a city block of property. In 1918, 10 little girls were moved into what was called back then the girls' playroom. They put them there in quarantine because they thought all of them had the Spanish flu. On the third night of their quarantine, a fire broke out and all 10 of them burned to death. Now, they didn't have any parents to complain about it. They didn't want to cause a blemish on the orphanage. They took those kids, those dead girls, and buried them in a potter's field 3 blocks west of where the dorm sits. And they lay there in anonymity from 1918 until December 14th, 2001. That's when they found those little girls completely by accident. It wasn't a potter's field anymore. It was the MUSC Children's Hospital parking lot. They're putting in a handicap ramp, and when they started ripping back that old asphalt with a front end loader, they found those 10 coffins 5 feet down. And it didn't take Quincy to figure out who they were. It was 10 little girls that had been burned to death. They still had the orphanage emblem on the face of each coffin. So they took all of them in the spring of '02 and reburied them at St. Lawrence Catholic on the outskirts of town. Put them all in a vault, put a white cross on top. But sadly, only 6 of their names, 4 of them were still unidentified. But, you know, a lot of people think that after those little girls got that proper burial, that perhaps they would cease all that nocturnal chicanery. Take my word, it still goes on. But most of the people I've interviewed have been in the last 5 years. Now, I did have a parent, a dad and his daughter on my walking tour one night. I told that story. And the daughter started crying. And not crying, sobbing, like uncontrollably. It turns out she wasn't sad. She was here for orientation. And her old man had rented her an upstairs room in that dorm for the upcoming fall semester. So, long story short, this guy lost a $1,300 security deposit because my little rinky-dink ghost tour. But that's life in an elderly city by the sea. Would prefer you leap in regards to real estate. Now, being that we're October 20th, there's a hurricane out there somewhere, Epsilon, I think. But in the fall, my mind always starts to think about the patron saint of South Carolina ghosts, the Gray Man. Now, first off, I've long thought there's at least 2 kinds of ghosts out there. One, the lost soul. Somebody who's dead. They're not up there. They're not here with us, but they're somewhere in between. Maybe in what Catholicism once called purgatory. Maybe they don't even know they're dead. Those are the sad tragedies, and there's an abundance of them here. But there is another type of ghost out there that someone of faith would call an angel. They die. They go up into the light. Then they come back because they love something or someone. That's what the gray man is. The last time somebody saw the gray man of note was September the 19th, 1989 on Pawleys Island, 70 miles north of Charleston. Young couple was walking on the beach holding hands when they saw out in the knee-deep waves a gray shadow walking. And they immediately knew his warning. Anybody who's even rented on Pawleys Island for a week knows the gray man's warning. If you see me, you get the heck out of Dodge because the big one's coming. They did. They got in their car that evening and drove to Kentucky. Turned out to be a wise move because Hurricane Hugo hit on the 21st and obliterated Pawleys Island. Now, I'm not going to go into the newscaster hyperbole about the storm, but at the time I was living and working at McAllister Funeral Home downtown. My boss said, don't evacuate. We're going to be busy. I'll never forget the first corpse I had to pick up after the storm. It was a guy who died trying to ride out the hurricane on his boat. He was, I won't mention his name, but he was 6'9", weighed almost 390. The guy was a giant, but he looked like a jigsaw puzzle with a couple of pieces gone. That's how mangled he was by the wind and the waves that night. And that's what that young couple saw sitting on a safe, dry couch in Kentucky watching the news. So when they came home 4 days after the storm, they expected a suburban apocalypse. They expected to come home and find at best some underwear hanging out of a bent palmetto tree like Spanish moss. What they found when they rolled up onto their cul-de-sac flipped their wigs. Amidst all that debris and all that destruction was their house. It was one of the only ones to have survived on the southern end of Pawleys Island. Every shingle was still on the roof. The French doors were left open, but there were still notes on the fridge with magnets. And if you believe the local press up there, a beach towel still hanged off the back balcony. That's the gray man's warning. See me? Take that ridiculous leap of faith and leave immediately. Both you and your property will be spared the fury of the storm. It sounds absurd, but I've interviewed in my life 5 people who've seen and obeyed the gray man and are still around it talking to my tape recorder. I've also interviewed the relatives of 7 who didn't. They saw him, they joked or bragged about it to friends or family, then they died in the storm surge, usually with a Pabst Blue Ribbon in one hand. The old hurricane party turned fatal, so living in this area my entire life, I've always taken that story with a great deal of seriousness. First time I heard it, I was 6. My mom read me a story about this young man named William Latchicott. Seems in 1801, this guy hears about a storm for some fishermen. So he gets on a fast horse, takes off on a 17-mile ride to warn his fiance's family about this beast coming in from the Atlantic. Well, according to me mom, 16 miles into this madcap horse ride, a low-hanging oak branch caught him in the throat. Every time I think of that guy, I think of a turtle on his back on the interstate. He's paralyzed, but he's completely conscious. And as he's laying there in the mud, feeling the barometer rapidly drop, he knows that in a few moments, the hammer of the gods is going to come down from on high and smite him. That's his unfinished business. That's why he's back on that stretch of beach 70 miles north of Charleston, offering that second chance. And I know the gray man's irrelevant today. We've got Jim Cantori. We've got triple, super, and pinpoint Doppler 5000 radar. But back in the old days when a ship was made out of wood and held together by tar and 2-inch nails, if he sailed into a tiny little tropical depression, it was like putting a goldfish in a blender. You found nothing when it was all over with. That's why he's the patron saint of the South Carolina coast. Now, does anybody have any questions about anything? Let me know if you do, please. I think we'll another story to tell if you don't have any.
And feel free to write in any of your questions in the Q&A section. We can read them out loud.
I'll tell a story while people are pondering their questions. While they're getting their affairs settled and are orchestrating a perfect edit on the question. I haven't told the story in many years, so it's going to be sloppy, but it's a cool story. On Upper King Street near Calhoun is a building called, well, that's an Urban Outfitters. It's like a hipster clothing store now. But when I was a little kid, my dad worked for the Beach Company, and they used to own and operate most of the vaudeville theaters in Charleston. And that building was the Garden Theater. Been around since 1917, I think. I remember going into that building many times as a kid and snooping around. But back in the early 90s, a guy named Wade Kersey used to be a guy that he worked for the Gilliard, the Dock Street, and the Garden Theater. He went in there to cut on the lights for a performance that was going to take place, a rehearsal performance during Spoleto back in the early 90s. He walked into the dark theater, had his flashlight, and he was shining it around looking for a fuse box when he saw an African-American gentleman sitting in the front row of the theater, well, a locked theater. So he shined his light in the guy's face and he said, "Hey, what you doing here?" He said the second he spoke to that guy, the guy fired as if from some sort of an ectoplasmic cannon from that front row up into the balcony, 85 rows up, in a flash. And the belief is this, this guy, God knows what happened to him. But perhaps, maybe there was some sort of interesting incident where he tried to impress his young lady. They got humiliated and had to sit in the balcony. The point is this. There was a picture taken of this guy actually years ago by a concerto, some dude who was a conductor rather, for Spoleto. After the performance, he had everybody facing backstage. He took the picture, and in the back top balcony, you could see this guy sitting there with his head in his hands like this, wearing a little newspaper boy hat from the 1920s or 30s. I've never seen it. I'd love to see it. I'd kill to see it, actually. Hey, Mike, to be honest with you, I don't know any stories. I don't know any stories about Daniel Island because it was rural and farm for so long. I mean, the modern properties that sit on Daniel Island are so relatively new compared to the rest of the Low Country that I think the ghost stories it'll be a while before they sort of simmer and appear. But if you know any, let me know. Seriously, I'm down for some fresh meat in regards to Daniel Island as far as some good ghost stories. Jessica, you asked if there's any good stories about the old jail downtown. The old jail, there's a tour that goes through there. A lot of people suffered there, but I've passed by that thing many times and heard the tours going on. I hear some crazy, outrageous stuff. I heard somebody say one time, I think it was a carriage driver. I'm not dogging the carriage drivers, but I did hear a guy say one time that like 50,000 people died in the old city jail, which is mathematically impossible, I think, for as long as the building was in use. But no, I do know this. The old city jail downtown on Magazine and Wilson Streets is fodder for a lot of legends. One of the biggest misconceptions about the Low Country and supernatural and legends combined is probably Lavinia Fisher. Everybody grows up hearing the story that Lavinia Fisher was a serial killer, and she and her husband had this crazy contraption where they would turn a wheel and sleeping guest's bed would turn over and they would dump into a cellar below the 6 Mile house out towards Dorchester Road and Meeting Street. And they would rob them and kill them. First off, anybody that lives around here knows very well there's no cellars in Charleston. We're at sea level at best. But as it turns out, Lavinia was actually the victim. She was actually a mulatto woman who was accused of defending her. Well, she was accused of murder because she killed a guy who was trying to assault her. And because she had that one drop of black blood, she wound up being hanged for it. But man, if you ever hear anybody saying she was demonic, the bride of the devil, a serial killer, look at them with great chagrin, please, at the very least, because she really was the victim in that story. And she probably did spend a little bit of time in the old city jail before her execution in 1817, but I've never met anybody who's legitimately seen her ghost. I think that's one of those classic legends that pops up when you have a remarkable story like that. Yeah. Ron, you work at the College of Charleston. College of Charleston has, there's so many stories. I'll give you a kind of a little survey of the ghosts in the neighborhood of the College of Charleston. You've got the Embassy Suites Hotel, which is the original Citadel. There's a guy that's missing the very top of his head from here off. He's believed to be a cadet from the middle of the 19th century that in my humble opinion, was someone who died in a hazing accident back when it was the Citadel. The people that have seen him over the years call him Halfhead, which is not the world's greatest nickname, in my humble opinion. The Embassy Suite, directly next door to that, is the Francis Marion. There's a gentleman, Ned Cohen was his name. He leaped out of the building during the Depression, and he's been seen on the either 10th or 11th floor. He looks, according to 80, 90 eyewitnesses, a bit like Dustin Hoffman playing Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman. He's short, he's balding, and the way he walks down the hallway, it almost looks like the road has kicked his rear end 1,000 times. He looks bedraggled, he looks beleaguered. But the fascinating thing is when he's seen, there's a cold spot that stays on the hallway of the 10th or the 11th floor of the Francis Marion for upwards of 2 hours after he's seen, which is outstanding and remarkable. One of the eyewitnesses to the sighting of Ned Cohen in the Francis Marion was General Mark Clark, who was Douglas MacArthur's second in command in World War II. I mean, a 4-star general. I cannot tell you guys how many times a little old lady will call me up and go, "Are you the guy that wrote the book? There's a ghost in my house." And it's always a little old lady. But when I get around to interviewing her, I have to ask the big question, what does it do? And she'll go, "Well, at night my staircase creaks." And then I look at her house. It's 290 years old, and it's built on landfill. That's not a ghost. That's gravity. When a 4-star general sees something and writes about it in his memoirs, to me as a researcher, that's gold. Now, any other questions I can answer about anything? To anybody?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A section. One from Bill Payer. Does the College of Charleston warn prospective students about the alleged ghosts of orphan girls and ongoing fire alarms and voices?
They do not, but the story is out there, so there's a very good chance they know about it. But I will say this, the dormitory situation for freshmen and sophomores at the college is so sparse, I don't think they care. I think they're going to live in the dorm anyway, and if they don't live in the dorm, if they're scared of that, they might wind up living in another haunted house somewhere in Radcliffe Borough downtown. So, the odds are just deal with it and learn to live with the little girls, because all they're doing is playing. I mean, their unfinished business, as I said, is their childhood. There's nothing malicious. There's nothing demonic about them. They're just little kids playing, in my humble opinion, although the fire alarms would be annoying during the exam season.
And one from Beth Bush. Are there any stories from the Yorktown? My son camped out there with his Boy Scout troop and was pretty spooked.
Yeah, there's a great book about all the ghosts on the Yorktown. I wish I'd written it. I did not. And in fact, I always kind of feel cheesy for telling those stories because somebody else did all the research on it. But you think about, this is what I know. This is my very, very quick thumbnail sketch. There were several suicides on board the Yorktown, but there were many more people killed by Japanese machine gun fire and kamikazes. I do know that they had security cameras on in more recent years, and a lot of times the animatronic displays they have in the middle of the night will pop on as if somebody set them off and start talking. I don't know of anything specific. I can't tell you any names or anything like that, but good God, I mean, more than dozens of men died on the Yorktown when it was in action, World War II action. It's its own little city by the sea, so like any city, it's got its ghost stories. Anybody else questions about anything I can answer? If you do have any questions later on, I've got a webpage, edmacytours.com. Please feel free to fire me an email, and I'd be honored to answer your questions about anything. Or, and I always say this, if you have a good ghost story downtown, Daniel Island, anywhere in the Low Country, let me know. I'm always looking for new stories to tell people and to do some basic research on. If you have time to hear one more story, let me look and see. I got to tell you this one story, please, if I may. It's a College of Charleston ghost story. 12 Glebe Street. The college bought the house, according to the records, in 1966 for $16,700. They bought it for the price of a Kia. But they bought it sight unseen. Every door and every window on 12 Glebe Street was covered up in plywood, so they had no idea what it looked like inside until they owned it. Cash deal, no inspection needed. When they closed on it, some engineers went in to see if it even had a floor. And the first thing they did was gag. Apparently, an elderly woman had been living in the property for 40 years prior to 1966. She lived on the first floor. And in that room, she had a camping toilet with a plastic bag in it, thus the gagging, a sleeper sofa, a small black and white TV, and a hot plate. The rest of the house, 7 other rooms were boarded up like a mausoleum. This old lady turned an 8-room property into a single-room efficiency apartment. She'd even built a wall in front of the stairs, making the entire top floor totally inaccessible for decades. Engineers went in, they gutted it, they made it beautiful, and in 1968, they moved the first sane residents in quite some time. It was a couple, Scott and Ruth Steinberg. They were working as administrators at the school, and part of their pay, their stipend, was getting to live in that house for a year for free. Well, the Steinbergs were in that place 2 weeks before they realized that old lady had built those crazy walls and partitions. August 1968, they were in bed reading. 9 p.m., lights were on dim because both of them were reading in bed when a 6'2" male walked out of the wall and stood over them at the foot of the bed. The guy was in his mid-30s, short hair, clean shaved, very well dressed. He had on a round collared suit and an ascot, one of those Thurston Howell III ties they used to wear in the Victorian period. But the thing about him that the Steinbergs said they will never forget, nor will the other 3 couples who saw him at the foot of their bed, his vain attempts to speak. All 8 people, 4 couples, said that not only did he tower over him and look him directly in the face, but he tried to talk. His lips moved, his hands gestured, but no words came out. It was like an immediate silent movie, or a case of Broca's aphasia. After 9 seconds of this, and I counted that one time in my head, that's an eternity. Watching that silent pantomime go down to the foot of your bed, he gave up. A visible look of frustration fell over his face. He dropped his head and hands, turned on his heel, and he walked back through the wall. Now, who he is, I have no idea. Before I finished my second book, Haunted Charleston, I dug up every tax record, every deed, and every death certificate for anybody who's ever put a shadow in that house. And I came up with a shoebox full of nada. But despite not knowing who it is, it's one of my favorites because it proves to people like me who believe in this kind of stuff that maybe there's cognizance from the other side. You know, when I used to think, when I thought of a ghost, I thought of the tram at Disney, perpetual figure 8. But now I think we're the AM people. What we're talking about right now is the FM people, and sometimes they meet. That was anticlimactic.
I got 2 more questions for you. One from Beth Bush. Would love to know if you've had any stories about the old Grace Bridge.
Yeah. 1946, February, a ship, it was a 470-foot-long ship. It was called the Nicaragua Victory, which is Spanish for Nicaragua Victory, broke loose in a storm and struck the bridge. And at the time, several cars were on it. There was a bread truck. There was an old Willys Jeep driven by a guy who just 8 weeks earlier got back from World War II, who wrote in his diary, "I survived a Japanese machine gun nest at Guadalcanal. I'll be damned if I'm going to die on a bridge on a Sunday morning in my hometown." And an Oldsmobile driven by a guy named Elmer Lawson. Lawson was taking his family to eat barbecue after church. Wife, kids, mother-in-law, and when the ship struck it, they fell into the harbor. And, you know, since then, from 46 until the Grace Bridge was dismantled by dynamite in 2005, people have reported seeing this phantom Oldsmobile with shadows inside of it. People with no faces, looking straight forward, looking straight ahead. It's a creepy story. And, you know, as much as I enjoy a good ghost story, I hope nobody ever sees those phantoms on the new bridge. I hope now that the highway they died on is out in the ocean, they can rest in peace.
And I got another one from Nikki Campbell. Are there any slaves who have come back to haunt people?
Yeah, there's a little kid, Boy Jim was his official name in the transaction records. He's known as George. You know, it's a little building called the 1837 Bed and Breakfast, which is on Wentworth Street down by the College of Charleston. And it's a sad story, from what I know, saw his parents be escorted away, bound for a slave ship in Charleston Harbor, due for Richmond, Virginia. And being a small kid, 6, 7 years old, he leaped into the harbor to try to reunite himself with his folks, and he drowned. And when people stay in that room, so I don't know if it's got a number. I think they used to have an apple on the door. The third floor of the Battery Carriage House Inn, they would tell their guests, if you see something rambunctious, like a little kid jumping up on the bed or the rocking chair going vigorously back and forth, just say, George, stop it, and it will cease immediately. Meaning that dynamic between adult and child still exists in the afterlife. But yeah, Boy Jim, as he was known in real life, was actually a slave, and there's many more. That's just one that pops into my head. But to be honest with you, they're not that well known if they took place out in the boondocks or on a plantation, because who was there to see it, you know?
And I have a personal question that's sort of a random one.
Yeah.
As I recall, the only casualty of the first bombing of Fort Sumter was one horse that died. Are there any good horse or animal ghost stories?
Yeah,
Around Charleston?
right next door to 12 Glebe Street is the President Robert Smith House at the College of Charleston, and dignitaries invited to dinner at that house, including John Rutledge, the first dictator of South Carolina, as they called him, would feel a cat swirling around their feet while they had dinner there. And I think Smith's wife was a savior to feral cats. And if you go down to the college, you'll see numerous. I mean, God, last time I was down there a couple of weeks ago, I saw 7 of them at dusk. But I think there's a very big population of cats still wandering around the College of Charleston. But it was believed to be one that a beloved cat of the bishop's wife, died, and its spirit still circles around people's feet as they eat in the great dining room at that house. Yeah, I've always thought the animal world has as much of or more of a soul than most humans, and I believe they can come back. And I've heard some good ones, not Charleston based, but I've heard some good ones from people I've met over the years that make me feel sad, but also kind of happy too, that they do have that strong bond with those that love them. Guys, any other questions about anything? Hey, listen, if you have one, I'd love to answer it. But if you get a chance, I always say this to people that I meet that have never been to Charleston before. If you get a chance to wander around, there's some more remarkable little graveyards. For instance, the Circular on Meeting and Cumberland Street. If you walk into that graveyard, the first thing you'll see is about a dozen and a half headstones made of Connecticut blue slate with a skull and crossbones emblazoned on the top. It's not a pirate's grave. It's an old image of faith called the Memento Mori, which was the early Christians' way of reminding each other that if you don't pray, that's all that'll be left of you one day is rot. The bones were the grim reminder of what awaited the unsaved. But I'm not a preacher. I like people to look at the dates of death on those old headstones and look how short those people's lives were. Think about what you have at home in your medicine cabinet. Think about what you brought on the last trip you went on in a duffel kit, amoxicillin, Gold Bond, Listerine. Not even real Listerine, but the fake kind from Walmart made by Equate. If you could take a $2.39 bottle of that stuff and somehow fling it back in time, say some old country doctor found it 130 years ago, I guarantee you he needed it. I guarantee his breath smelled like an elephant's butt. But had he instead poured it on his hands before he went to the operating table or to the delivery table, think about how much longer those people underneath those chunks of stone would have lived. If I can end on an upbeat note, technology's let all of us live a better life than everybody we've been talking about. But I hope you enjoyed some of the stories. Again, if you have any questions, please hit me up. I'd love to answer them. If you do not, thanks for listening to me. I hope you did have a good time. Happy Halloween to everybody, too.
Great, thank you. We actually do have 2 questions still on there if you've got the time to take them.
I do, absolutely.
Number 1 is from Bill Payer. Are you disappointed you've never personally seen a ghost? Any reason why?
I'm not disappointed because I never expect to. I think, you know who I think sees a ghost? People who have a Hollywood or M. Night Shyamalama Ding Dong called The Sixth Sense, or somebody's thinking about breakfast. I think when you attempt often, as I have, to see a ghost, you wind up wasting time in film. Take it from the king of wasting time in film. To be honest with you, yeah, I think I'm out of the loop because I'd really like to. So not disappointment, but I would love to see one. Very much love to see one, Bill.
And one from Mike Dolman. Are you sensitive to the presence of spirits or spiritual activity?
Not at all. I'm in mediocre to decent shape because I walk a lot. And when I do walk into the Dock Street Theater, though, if I'm giving a tour or if I'm just showing it to friends or something, the only thing that's ever happened to me is when I get up to that second floor where that lady, that prostitute walks on her knees down the hallway, I lose my breath. I kind of get winded a little bit. And, you know, I can run up 10 flights of steps in another building and it just doesn't affect me. That's the only thing I've ever noticed. And it might be psychosomatic because I know there's something there, but that's the only sensitivity I have is on the second floor of the Dock Street Theater. And it's not visual, it's just I lose my breath a bit.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Beth Bush just wanted to say thank you so much for coming out. We really
Oh,
appreciate
yeah.
it. You know, we're recording this, so we will be posting this up later, presumably on our website. But if you guys have any more questions, I've posted I posted Ed's contact website, so feel free to hit him up there.
Hey, Jessica asked if there's any good plantation ghost stories. Yeah, there's tons. The one that pops into my mind is the ne'er-do-well son of John Drayton. I think it was William Drayton on Drayton Hall. He was kind of like the second son and he didn't succeed. And I think he paid for it mentally and psychologically and emotionally. And he's been seen mainly by the docents that work at Drayton Hall up on the second floor. And it's not an exciting ghost story. It's just like, there's William Drayton up there on the top balcony. But yeah, I mean, you think about the drama and the reality show and the horror that was the plantation system. And yeah, there's tons of good ghost stories out there. Tons of horrible ghost stories out there, I should say. But guys, thanks again. I again hope you had a good time, and thanks for listening to me, and happy Halloween. And please email me if you have any questions about anything.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Appreciate
likewise.
it all.
Cheers.
Have a good evening all.
Bye, everybody.